Okay. Okay, screen share. Let's hope this works. Got a small group today, but thank you guys for being here. The first time I connected my, I don't know why it did that. You don't need to see my Zoom screen. Okay, can you guys see, are you seeing the contracts up on the screen? Can anyone tell me? I can't see you.
No.
No, I see a
No,
Zoom.
okay.
thing.
Let
You
me
want me to
stop
get it?
and try again.
Hey, Deb, there's one other thing I want to talk about open houses, but I'll do it at the end.
Okay, thank you. All right, yeah, thank you guys for signing in. I forgot to do that the other day. So if you were here the other day, go ahead and say that you were here the other day as well. Now, do you guys see the contracts?
Yes.
Okay. So we are on page 54. I'm trying to get that title information I told you about. We had a couple computer crashes in the last few months at home. And for some reason, I cannot find, even in my emails, and that's bizarre because normally I keep everything. I cannot find that little cheat sheet that I have from Universal Title. So I've asked them to send me another copy. So once I get that, I'll send it out to you guys. All right. So notice a possible filing of mechanics liens. Okay, we're working through the contract. The Code of Virginia permits persons who have performed labor or furnished materials for the construction, removal, repair, or improvement of any building or structure to file a lien against the property. This lien may be filed at any time after the work is commenced. I'm sorry? After the work is commenced or the material is furnished, but no later than 90 days from the last day of the month in which the lien or last performed the work or furnished materials, or 90 days from the time the construction, removal, repair, or improvement is terminated. An effective lien for work performed prior to the date of settlement may be filed after settlement. Legal counsel should be consulted. So what that's saying is, let's say you're John and Jane Jonas and you hire Robert Smith to come in and redo your kitchen cabinets. You've hired them to come in and reface your kitchen cabinets, strip off the old, put, freshen up the coat. And you tell him that, oh, by the way, one of the knobs is crooked, so I'm not paying your bill. Okay. You list the house, and you and Mr. Smith, you have not paid him. He's not come back to fix the crooked knob, whatever. Or even if there was a crooked knob, whether you paid it, as long as you didn't pay him as a seller, whether you feel that you have a right not to pay or whatever, but you don't pay him, the house goes on the market, it goes under contract, it goes to settlement. Okay. Now, Mr. Smith knows that you are selling your property, and so he's watching. So he may put a mechanics lien on before you sell it, which most of them would, if they know you're selling the property. But he has the right to put it on afterwards too, as long as it's within that 90 days of work being complete. And then that mechanics lien stays on that property, and it becomes the debt of the buyer as far as the deed goes, okay? The buyer then, if they bought the premium title insurance, it covers mechanics liens. The buyer doesn't have to worry about a thing. Their title company is going to take care of it. Their title policy, rather, is going to take care of it and get it cleaned up. They may or may not subrogate it back and try to track down the original seller and make them pay for it. But that's what the title company, that's the insurance policy the title company handles. when it's the premium title insurance policy for the homeowner. The standard title insurance policy does not cover mechanics liens. So, you know, it's not that much money. I always tell my clients it's better to be safe than sorry, because anything can happen, you know, in Virginia, especially in Virginia. Virginia is a very historical state, and there's been property around here that things have been dug up out of the ground that are considered historical, so it can stop construction all of a sudden. So having that premium title policy is a good thing, and it does cover mechanics liens. Otherwise, the new buyer would have to sell the seller to try to recoup the money, because that lien stays on the property. Okay. Possession date. Unless otherwise agreed in writing between the seller and the buyer, seller will give possession of the property at settlement, including delivery of key fobs, codes, digital keys, if any. If seller fails to do so and occupies the property beyond settlement, the seller will be a tenant at sufferance of the buyer and hereby expressly waives all notice to quit as provided by law. Buyer will have the right to proceed by any legal means available to obtain possession of the property. Seller will pay any damages and costs incurred by buyer, including reasonable attorney fees. So if the seller doesn't leave, then the buyer can go and get an eviction notice without waiting any period of time, okay? The seller's in its sufferance. Normally, if a seller needs to stay behind, then they do what's called a rip back, which we'll get to that when we do the miscellaneous addenda. And we'll talk about how all that works later. But so you as a listing agent, you need to be on track with your clients. And like I told you the story about the other day, finding all that pile of junk. The listing agent found the stuff in the attic, but he did not go in the basement. So in effect, until the house was cleaned out, even though his client wasn't physically there, they were still occupying the house, okay? So that listing agent knew he had to do everything he could to get everything out of that house or pay a rent back fee to the buyer, basically, is what was going to happen if it couldn't get cleaned out that day. A situation that David Robertson of Universal Title in Falls Church had about a year or so ago was an attorney was the seller. And when he realized that in Virginia, once you go to the settlement table, it has to go to the court before it's recorded, officially recorded, he then said he was not turning over the keys to the buyer, and they were closing on a Friday. So he felt that he didn't have to do anything until Monday, that he could possess that house and hold on to the keys until Monday. And David gently went through this paragraph with him and explained the position he was putting himself in. And that's an attorney who read a paragraph of something and dug his heels in because he's not a real estate attorney and didn't pay attention to what the rest of the contract said. So he had to be firmly spoken to by another attorney and explained that the agreement he signed strictly says he must leave the property on the day of settlement unless otherwise agreed upon. Okay. Even though it doesn't get recorded till maybe the next day or the day after, it's still considered possession on the day that that everything transpires. So several ways you can do that. I had a closing yesterday. So I told the buyer's agent, when you do your final walkthrough, please feel free to take the key out of the lockbox and give that to your client as their entry back into the home after settlement. That agent holds onto that key until settlement is finished. All other keys, and if I had any manuals or anything like that, will be, and I always tell them what the designated drawer is in the kitchen. And everything else that we're turning over to the buyer is in that one drawer. So when I first take a listing, for example, I'm in the kitchen with my clients and I look around. You can always tell you're going to open that junk drawer right away. You know where they've got, everyone has a junk drawer somewhere. And I suggest that they go ahead and pull everything out of this junk drawer right now, sort through and figure out where it goes, and designate that drawer, because they're used to it being a junk drawer, is a drawer that everything that they need to convey over to the buyer once their house sells goes there. So while they're packing up their stuff and they come across the manual to the washer and dryer, the manual to this, you know, whatever they have, the keys. They start gathering keys up from all their family members. You know, and then as we get closer to closing, I always remind them, you know, any fobs to the house, any remotes to the fireplaces, all stuff like that, put in that drawer. Some people have little tiny, looks like a little tiny straight metal thing, but it's to unlock doors, you know, and I said, if you come across those, that's what that is, put them in the drawer. If they, and I always tell my clients, and I do this for myself personally, if I have something that comes like with my stove that's, or one of my appliances, how you like have to turn to get into the panel or something, like an Allen wrench or whatever, I put in a little Ziploc bag and I say what it is on it, and I throw it in a drawer designated for stuff like that. So that I'm not going through a drawer looking at all these different devices and keys and going, what is this? It, you know, it says what it is. And I asked my client to do the same. I said, if you know these are backdoor keys or shed keys or keys to the gate, fencing or pool houses or whatever they have, you know, list that out. Any instructions you have on any maintenance contracts you have and who you have maintenance contracts with, do that. It was kind of interesting yesterday. The buyer loves plants as much as my seller did, and my seller had a lot of plants in the backyard, a little oasis, and we all agreed to meet after closing so that they could walk the yard and she could share with them what all the plants were, and my seller wrote everything up for the new buyer and discussed what all the plantings were. So that was a kind of interesting experience. I've never done that before. It was a very nice experience. But the other agent and I both were there making sure that no conversation went off kilter in any way. But it was a good day. It was a hot day out there, but it was a good day. Okay. Paragraph 23, fees. Fees for the preparation of the deed, that portion of the settlement agent's fee billed to the seller, costs of releasing existing encumbrances, seller's legal fees, and other proper charges assessed to the seller will be paid by the seller. Fees for the title exam, except as otherwise provided, survey, recording, including those for any purchase money trust, and that portion of settlement agent's fee billed to the buyer, buyer's legal fees, and any other proper assessed charges assessed to the buyer will be paid by the buyer. Fees to be charged will be reasonable and customary for the jurisdiction in which the property is located. Grantor's tax and regional congestion relief fee for Alexandria, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William and Arlington counties and all cities contained within shall be paid by the seller. Buyers shall pay recording charges for the deed and other purchase money trusts. Well, on this closing I had yesterday, we found out that not only in Arlington did they have this congestion relief tax fee, which is now called the Washington Metropolitan Area Association, whatever, transit tax fee. Arlington then added another fee directly for Arlington itself for congestion relief tax. And it was 0.05 or whatever on $1,000. So my client had the privilege of paying an extra $425 to the county of Arlington yesterday, because they added their own congestion relief tax fee. I don't know that Fairfax and the others have done that as well, but that was a new tax in the last couple of weeks in Arlington. Okay, so those of you who have Arlington listings, beware of that. Make sure you let your sellers know. Sellers pay those fees. So in those counties, and you guys need to look, you know, some of you are here from Fredericksburg, but I know there's a Fredericksburg agent who has an Arlington listing. We've got Alexandria, Arlington, and Falls Church agents with us. So be very careful when you're talking to your clients in these jurisdictions. If they've owned that house for more than 5 years, and even if they've owned it less than 5 years, if they've not sold in those many years, they are unaware of the congestion relief tax fee, okay? So as a seller, you need to let them know that that's what the seller has to pay to close. Seller irrevocably instructs settlement agent to pay broker compensation fee at settlement as set forth in the listing agreement. and to disperse the compensation offered by the listing broker to cooperating brokerages in writing as of the date of offer, and the remaining amount of the broker's compensation to the brokerage. So the title company does not know what agreement you have with the seller, but they know what the MLS listing says. Now, most title companies will ask you as an agent, as a listing agent, what is your compensation? But if you're strictly thinking about them looking at the contract, they're looking at the listing from online, and it says that 2.5% goes to the buyer's agent, according to the MLS. The MLS is not listing agent compensation. So most title companies are going to ask the listing agent, what's your compensation? Or you're going to proactively tell them. So if the listing agent is charging 6% and they're paying the buyer's agents 2.5, that means the listing agent is getting 3.5. And the only time the other agent knows that that's happened is on the closing documents, okay? You always want to double check your commission. Don't assume that it's done correctly. And that's what most agents check first before they check anything else, unfortunately. But now in this day and age, it doesn't happen as much as it used to, because in MLS, everything's recorded when there's a change. But years ago, you didn't have that record of recording every keystroke that changed. And there were unscrupulous agents who may have been offering extra compensation, for example, or they had a 6% split. They had a 6% listing and they did a 3 and 3 with the buyer's agent, but then it was a buyer's market. And so the buyer offered, say, 20 grand less, and the seller ended up taking it because there's no other offers. And so the listing agent would go into MLS and change that compensation from 3% to 2%. Okay. Now, if the agent who showed that property had not downloaded a copy showing that 3%, back in the old system, there was no tracking to see that that compensation had been changed. And then you're at this stalemate. So we always train agents, the moment you show a property to someone, you download a copy of that listing agreement, okay? And shows compensation, and especially when there are bonuses involved. Every now and again, when it becomes a buyer's market, and we will be in one at some point, they may say, 10,000 extra commission over the top of 3% if you bring a buyer by, say, the end of September, okay? You always want to make sure first of all, that offer of bonus is not in the agent-to-agent notes only. It could be, but it needs to be in the compensation portion. That's the legal binding part of the agreement, is that it's where the commission is. So if you ever see a bonus that's in the agent-to-agent comment area only, then you want to proactively get the other agent's broker to sign an acknowledgement and an agreement stating that you are receiving that compensation if the deal goes forward. We've been involved in some cases where the agent reneged on that, took it back, and we had to go before the board with them and get the money back for our agent, who in good faith sold the property. Okay, so broker's fees. Okay, we already did that one. Adjustments: rents, taxes, water, sewer charges, condominium unit association, homeowners and or owners association, regular periodic assessments, if any, and other operating charges are to be adjusted to the date of settlement. Taxes, general and special, are to be adjusted according to the most recent property tax bill for property issued prior to the settlement date, except that is recorded assessments for improvements completed prior to settlement, whether assessments have been levied or not, will be paid by the seller or allowance made at settlement. If a loan is assumed, which is pretty rare, interest will be adjusted to the date of settlement, and buyer will reimburse the seller for any escrow amounts. Mostly on loans, your interest is paid in arrears, okay? So my clients who settled yesterday, their July interest would be paid in their August statement. So they're gonna, so that bank, their mortgage payoff is including, you know, when they got their payoff statement in July, when they, what they thought was their payoff statement, and then all of a sudden I tell them on Monday night that their payoff statements, you know, 4,000 more than they thought it was going to be. I'm like, that's because it's your July interest. So your interest is paid in arrears. So when you paid in August, you're paying July's interest. Okay. So it's to the date of settlement. It's not to the hour of settlement. I've been in a couple situations where one party is demanding, it's normally the listing or the landlord side. And this happens more in leases than in sales, that it's to the hour. They want the 24-hour clock. No, it's to the date of settlement, no matter what time you settle. It's the date of settlement. And as listing agents, you should encourage your client to keep the utilities on through settlement, which means turn them off the day after settlement. Okay. So my client's case, I said, please have your utilities turned off on the 30th. Now the buyer's agent should be encouraging their buyer to turn their utilities on the day of closing, which is the 29th. If the buyer does their job, the buyer takes over and then it all transfers on the 29th. But if the buyer does not do their job, which happens more than you want to know about, then the seller has done their due diligence and they have the utilities on through the day of settlement, because that, when someone walks into that house, do that walkthrough, the utilities have to be on. So if the seller were to turn them off on the day of settlement and the buyer did not do their job and get them turned on, and they go to do the walkthrough, the house is technically still belonging to the seller. The utilities are not on. The seller then has to have the utilities turned on so that the walkthrough can be done. So, you know, you want to be very careful about that. It's not that much money. Tell your seller it's not that much money. And if the buyer's doing their job, then they're going to end on the day of settlement anyway. But it's just to protect them through the day of settlement, especially if it's on a Friday. Okay, if it's on a Friday, most utilities will be Monday. Okay, but again, you know, the buyer, and as a listing agent, I'm going to say to the buyer's agent, my sellers set up their utilities. Please make sure your buyer's done the same. Oh, by the way, here are the utility company's numbers in case you don't have them, you know, type thing. So you're, you know, I, as a listing agent, try to manage the buyer's agents if I have a sense that they're not doing what they should be doing. Okay. I always just send a little courtesy email that what's going on, and you know, in a buyer's agent, you would check in with the listing agent, and you might say to them, could you please have your seller provide us with who has the utilities in your neighborhood? Because some neighborhoods, it could be Washington Gas, or it could be Columbia Gas or Novec. You know, you could be in that transitional area, you're not quite sure. So that your buyer's not online or calling various places, you know, have the seller tell them where the utilities are coming from. It could be like in a condo situation that the electricity is paid through the condo, or the water might be paid with the condo, but everything else you have to do on your own. So, you know, that's what you should be finding out when you're doing getting your condo documents as well. Okay. And then, so what happens is your seller goes by, that bill was just paid on the 15th of July. I paid for my water bills for the next 3 months. Well, you're going to get that, they're going to get that money back. Okay. It may not happen for 4 to 6 weeks. So you tell your seller, you make sure you contact these utilities with your new address. And most of us have online access to our accounts now. And sometimes some of these things allow you to go up in there and say how you want to receive your refund. Now, I left Falls Church in 2017 in April and moved out to Culpeper. And in summer, July of 2017, Washington Gas sent me a refund check of like $30 some. The next July, they sent me a refund check, not the same amount, but close to it. So for 3 years, I've got a refund from Washington Gas, and they don't know why. They don't know there are adjustments to their system or whatever. But, you know, I'm like, I don't mind having a couple extra bucks once in a while, but it's just kind of bizarre. But the other, you know, the electricity and all that, you know, they sent my one refund check. and then you're over with, your accounts are closed. So just make sure your clients know about that. And then as a courtesy, you can always remind your clients to make sure that they go into their loan service provider where they're selling their home and make sure that their address is updated in that portal, okay? Because it's no longer the house they sold, because they're gonna have, more than likely have escrows coming back to them. Because while they're paying their mortgage every month, they're also paying money toward their taxes and their insurance as part of their mortgage. And so those two things are setting an escrow. And depending on the time of year, so in my client's case, their mortgage company had just paid their second half of the taxes, or the first half of the taxes, like in the first part of July. But they always keep enough, at least 3 to 5 months worth of escrows in their account should someone not pay their mortgage. So they've got money sitting there in their account that does not need to go to their insurance company any longer, does not need to go to the tax bill any longer, because they've sold that property. So after everything gets recorded and their file is closed out, then that money comes back to them, because it is their money that they've prepaid to set in an escrow account, okay? And if they don't follow through and give their lender a way to reach them, then it sets in the lender's coffers until they figure out how to reach them. There's a site in Virginia, it's like Found Money something, and it's interesting. You should go in there and look it up. It's a legitimate site. And a lot of times it's stuff like that. People have left money in escrows, never followed up with who they needed to get their money back from, and they just have money sitting there in an escrow account. So as an agent, things like that sets you apart from other agents when you're thinking ahead for your client. You know, and now we're coming up, for example, to an election. People are moving. So, you know, make sure your client, remind them, oh, please make sure you go get registered to vote, type thing. It's just a courtesy. You're not giving them any advice, as far as you're just courteously suggesting to them they get registered to vote, okay? And now with COVID, everything's taking longer with the DMV and all that stuff. But anyway, it's a bit of a mess. Okay, attorney fees. If any party breaches the contract and a non-breaching party retains legal counsel to enforce its rights hereunder, the breaching party shall be entitled to recover against the breaching party. In addition to any other damages recoverable against any breaching party, all of its reasonable legal expenses incurred in enforcing its rights under this contract, whether or not suit is filed, and in obtaining, enforcing, and or defending any judgment related thereto, should any tribunal of competent jurisdiction determine that more than one party to the dispute has breached this contract, then all such breaching parties shall bear their own cost unless the tribunal determines that one or more parties is substantially the prevailing party, in which case any such substantially prevailing party shall be entitled to recover from any of the breaching parties, in addition to any other damages recoverable against the breaching party. And we've gone through this paragraph a couple times with the buyers and the listing agreements. So the party who does bad gets sued by the party who didn't do anything wrong, and it's adjudicated. But if the judge decides that the party who didn't really do anything wrong, didn't do some things quite right, then it could be proportionate. So instead of getting 100% of the judgment, they could give a percentage, or they share the blame. So it really depends. That's why it's so important. That's one of the main reasons why we teach this class, is because so many things get missed in a listing agreement, in a buyer's agreement, and in the contract. Things are not done properly. So when it becomes in front of a judge or an arbitrator or a mediator, and I was a paralegal both in California for about 5 years and in here for 5 years. So I've been through a couple trials and arbitrations and such. And so the first thing they do is, all that documentation comes rolling in. And then someone like me, who's the paralegal, our job is to sit there and look at it. And we line it up by date and we scrutinize it. And we're looking at amendments. So in Virginia, you've got your contract. And then every time you have an amendment, one stacks on top of the other, theoretically. So whatever's on top takes precedent from, so for example, if you say the seller's offering a $5,000 subsidy, but in the end, you've negotiated another $2,000 because of home inspection items and the lender's okay with it, then there should be an addendum stating that everyone has signed that the seller is crediting $7,000 to the buyer. So that supersedes what the contract says. So if someone was just looking at the contract, they would say, no, he only owes $5,000. But you have to look at all the documentation involved. But what if one of the two sellers hadn't signed that addendum? Then it's not valid. Okay, so that's why, who's at fault? Who didn't sign what document? Is it just a mission? Is it just a missed initial? No big deal? Or is it a big deal? And as David Roberts said, and I like to say, it's only a big deal when it's before the judge. And that's when it becomes a big deal. So that's why you want to look over your paperwork, double check your paperwork. As a buyer's agent, you want to present the best offer and the cleanest offer to a listing agent. They love to see clean offers. And when all things are equal, money and all that, a lot of times you might win the offer just because you have a clean written offer and they know you're responsible, and they're more willing to work with you than someone presenting a sloppy contract. From the listing side, you want to double check that everything's filled in, okay? You want to do your due diligence to make sure that everything is done correctly, like the FERPTA. You know, if you're a buyer's agent and you can't get a hold of a listing agent and you don't know what the FERPTA field should be, are they a foreign national? Are they, you know, a citizen or not? And you, when you submit the offer to the listing agent, you say, oh, by the way, please make sure your client completes paragraph, whatever. And when you get it back, if they haven't done it, you should call the agent back and say, please have your client check one of the two boxes at initially, okay? So then the buyers would initial it as well, because it's a change to the offer. Whenever anything gets changed in the initial offer going forward, then there has to be initials from both parties. So if you have 3 sellers and 2 buyers, and you're looking down through a contract, you should always find 5 initials. You know, and you look at the bottom to see what the initials are, and you see, you know, if there's only 4, whose initial is missing, okay? You know, and that's what the errors and omissions insurance is for little mistakes like that, mistakes. But you don't want to have to use that insurance. You don't have to rely on them to help you get out of a mess. Your broker first, and then that. Okay, performance. Delivery of required funds and executed documents to the settlement agent will constitute sufficient tender of performance. Funds from this transaction at settlement may be used to pay off any existing liens and encumbrances, including interest as required by lender and lien holders. So when you go to the settlement table, if the seller is upside down, they have to bring funds too. But generally, in most cases, they're going to walk away with some funds once all their bills are paid. The buyer has to come with funds, whether they're bringing cash, quote unquote, in a wire. They don't come up with actual cash. We can't do that. Or a certified check. And then after the balance sheet is done, buyers and sellers, all money in, all money out, all bills that the seller has is paid, including commissions. Then what's left over is the seller's proceeds, okay? So just like a buyer's agent, you're gonna go through that ALTA sheet with them, the settlement sheet, and make sure all those figures look like what their lender shared with them in the good faith. You as a listing agent also need to double check figures. In fact, my closing last week, for some reason, the agent's title company had put the $15,000 credit for the agent's EMD as a debit on the seller side. It was a typo, but it meant that it was asking my seller to bring a lot of money they weren't expecting to. But, you know, so that type of thing. So, you know, you need to go through. Had I not looked at that, and the title company wouldn't have been aware necessarily why that money was there, they should have been looking for some amendment stating why the seller was giving $15,000 to the buyer. And the lender certainly should have. There should have been some fail safes along the way. But you know, we got it corrected late Friday and they got that removed. So we could look at a clean settlement statement by Monday. Okay, default. If buyer fails to complete settlement for any reason other than the default of the seller, buyer shall be in default, and at the option of the seller, deposit may be forfeited to the seller as liquidated damages and not as a penalty. In such event, buyer shall be relieved from further liability to the seller. If seller does not elect, so that first group there, that's talking about the EMD, the earnest money deposit. That's why the higher the earnest money deposit, the more skin in the game a buyer has, the more willing in multiple offer situations that a seller is to take the deal, to make them the contract of choice. Because if something does go wrong, the seller has a higher amount of money to recoup if the buyer were to default, okay? Now, if seller does not elect to accept the deposit as liquidated damages, deposit may not be the limit of the buyer's liability in the event of a default. Buyer and seller knowingly, freely, and voluntarily waive any defense as to the validity of the liquidated damages under this contract, including seller's option to elect liquidated damages or pursue actual damages, or that such liquidated damages as void, as penalties, or are not reasonably related to the actual damages. So they can choose to accept it and walk away, or they move forward. So if deposit is forfeited, or if there is an award of damages by a court or compromise between buyer and seller and buyer, broker may accept and seller agrees to pay broker 1/2 the deposit in lieu of broker's fee, provided broker's share of any forfeited deposit will not exceed the amount due under the listing agreement. So the agent can still get paid, okay? Now, more than likely, you're going to turn around and relist it, and you're going to go for your full commission, but it does provide that the agent can get paid, okay? If seller fails to perform or comply with any of the terms and conditions of this contract, or fails to complete settlement for any reason other than the default by buyer, seller shall be in default, and buyer will have the right to pursue all legal or equitable remedies, including specific performances and or damages. Seller just refused to go to closing for whatever reason, they're in default because this is a contract. I've not run across that specific situation except for that one attorney who was going to refuse because he thought that he didn't have to turn over keys, but David explained to him he had to, and then it was done. If you're ever in a dispute of any kind between buyer and seller and you've tried to work it out, always show up at closing unless there's an agreement to show up with your client in good faith, even though you're pretty sure it's not going to happen, so that no one can say you didn't perform. Steve's always told people just to show up. Just go to the title company, go to your settlement agent, and see what happens. Because sometimes once one party realizes, and their agent or the brokers have been able to convince them, or their own attorneys, that they have no leg to stand on, they're going to show up. So if the party who's saying they're not showing up does in fact show up, but you don't show up, you don't want to be in default. So it's better to be told at the settlement table that we're not moving forward than not to show up at all, okay? If either seller or buyer refuses to execute a release of deposit when requested to do so in writing, and a court finds that such party should have executed the release, the party who refused to execute the release will pay the expenses, including without limitations, reasonable attorney fees incurred by the other parties in litigation. Seller and buyer agrees that no escrow agent will have any liability to any party on any account of disbursement of deposit or on account of failure to disburse deposit, except only in the event that the escrow agent's gross negligence or willful misconduct. The parties further agree that escrow agent will not be liable for the failure of any depository in which deposit is placed, and the seller and buyer will each will indemnify, defend, and save harmless escrow agent any loss or expenses arising out of the holding, disbursement, or failure to disperse deposit, except in the case of the escrow agent's gross negligence and willful misconduct. If buyer and seller is in default, then in addition to other damages, the defaulting party will immediately pay the cost incurred for the title examination, appraisal survey, and broker fees in full. Now, when you have an offer between the two parties, the buyer and seller, the buyer can put contingencies in place for home inspection, financing, appraisal, well and septic. They can have a home of sale contingency, which we're going to study all that. All those contingencies could be in place, and they get released based on the date of release. Plus, you have HOA and condo fees. So at any time, a buyer says, I want to void the contract on home inspection documents, okay? So today we ratify. Tomorrow, the seller delivers to the buyer the home inspection, the HOA documents. In the meantime, the house across the street that the buyer really prefers comes on the market. That buyer wants that other house. That buyer does not even have to open the HOA documents. In Virginia, they have 3 days to void the contract based on HOA once delivered. So the instance those documents are delivered, then they can send a release of deposit and a notice to void to the seller. The notice to void is a one-way communication. Hey, seller, we as the buyers are voiding this offer. The notice to release is an agreement that the buyers and sellers both have to sign to release the earnest money back to the buyer. If the seller says, look, they didn't even look at those documents and I'm not gonna, no, I'm not gonna sign that, okay? That seller is in violation. As a listing agent, you need to explain to them that the buyer has every right within that 3 days, whether they read the entire thing cover to cover or never open it. They have a right to void under Virginia state law, and that seller has cannot refuse to sign. And when they do, and they have, it goes to court, and then that seller has to pay all the court fees. Okay, so they end up in a mess. Same with, contingencies on home inspection items. Even if the seller says, I'll fix anything, the buyer can still say, I want to void. Whether they're not comfortable with what would be fixed or they found another home of choice, it doesn't matter. It's their right to void. And the seller cannot cross their arms and get angry over it, okay? 29. See, what time do we have? 1 o'clock. Why don't we take a break till 1:15? I need a bit of a break. My phone is blowing up right now. So I need to see what's going on. I'm just going to sit here and check my phone. If anyone has a question, you're free to ask it. Okay, we're back to paragraph 29, page 56 in the current book. Other disclosures. Buyer and seller should carefully read this contract to be sure that the terms accurately express their respective understandings as to their intentions and agreements. Broker can counsel on real estate matters, but if legal advice is desired by either party, such party is advised to seek legal counsel. Buyer and seller are further advised to seek appropriate professional advice concerning the condition of the property or tax and insurance matters. My client asked me yesterday, so what on this statement will help me on my taxes next year? What was my response? Talk to your CPA. I said, taxes change all the time. That's why we have CPAs and accountants, or TurboTax. The following provisions of this paragraph disclose some matters which the parties may investigate further. These disclosures are not intended to create a contingency. Any contingency must be specified by adding appropriate terms to this contract. The parties acknowledge the following disclosures. Property condition. Various inspection services and home warranty insurance programs are available. Broker is not advising the parties as to certain other issues, including without limitation, water quality and quantity, including but not limited to lead or other contaminants, sewer, septic, soil condition, flood area hazards, possible restrictions of the use of property due to restrictive covenant, zoning, subdivisions, or environmental laws, easements or other documents, airports and aircraft noise, planned land use, roads or highways, construction materials and or hazard materials, including but not without limitation, flame retardant, treated plywood, which is known as FRT, radon, urea formaldehyde foam insulation, UFFI, mold, polybutylene pipes, synthetic stucco, EIFS, underground storage tanks, defective drywall, asbestos, and lead-based paint. Information relating to these issues may be available from the appropriate government authorities. So we know about the lead-based paint. You have to declare if the house was built before 1978. It's just a blanket declaration that they could have lead-based paint. But when it comes to water quality and all that, if your client is concerned or have read about water conditions somewhere, then it's up to them to have the appropriate inspections done. You don't advise, you don't say, oh, just buy a Brita system or just buy a water filtration system. No, you let them, if there's any uncomfortability whatsoever. In Virginia, we don't have to show a map of where the airports are, but Maryland, there's a map that, they have to give to everybody as part of their disclosure package that identifies all the airplanes flying over, where all the airports are. Okay, legal requirements. All contracts for sale of real property must be in writing to be enforceable. Upon ratification and delivery, this contract becomes a legally binding agreement. Any changes to this contract must be made in writing for such changes to be enforceable. So there's no handshakes, there's no chit-chatting. It's got to be in writing. And when it's an amendment or added to the original, all parties, buyers and sellers, have to agree in writing. Okay? The agents don't necessarily have to agree. It's the buyers and sellers who have to agree. Okay? Financing. Mortgage rates and associated charges vary with financial institutions and the marketplace. Buyer has the opportunity to select the lender and the right to negotiate terms and conditions of the financing subject to the terms of this contract. The financing may require substantial lump sum balloon payments on the due dates. Buyer has not relied upon any representation regarding the future availability of mortgage money or interest rates for the refinancing of any such lump sum payments. So, you as an agent, whether you've been here 5 minutes or 15 years, you don't say to your client, oh, it's cyclical and don't worry about it. Eventually the rates will go back down, blah, blah. When I bought my house, my first home in 1985, my sister and I, the interest rates had been about 18%. We got it, I think, for about 13%. And people were like patting us on the back saying, oh, you girls got a lucky deal. The rates just went down. Now, the following year, they'd gone down to 10%. People really thought they were in clover at that point. And here we are, when we go above 4.5, people start panicking. So be very careful about talking about interest rates with people, because that's the job of their lender. And if a client says to you, what do you think about me doing a 5, 7, 10-year ARM because the rates are really good, you don't give advice whatsoever, okay, at all. Because you don't know what's going to happen at the end of that term, what the interest rate is going to be and how much their mortgage payment could change. It can literally double from one month to the next. So you got to be very careful not to advise about that. And no one knows what's going to happen from minute to minute. And COVID, above all else, should have taught us that, okay? Broker. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the broker is being retained solely as a real estate agent and not as an attorney. You've heard this before, blah, 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 okay? You're real estate agents. Again, if you are an attorney and you are a real estate attorney and you also are a realtor, only if that client is paying you for both jobs can you advise them as a real estate attorney, okay?
If they are a real estate attorney in that situation, would they get in trouble?
No, they wouldn't get in trouble, but the client has to retain them. The question was, would they get in trouble? They would if the client did have a separate agreement with them, yes. Because this agreement is pertaining to this contract and this real estate transaction. So if an attorney is an agent, they should have a separate agreement to represent their client as their attorney as well as their agent. Make sure there's no crossing up in any conflict. So property taxes. Your property tax bill could substantially increase following settlement. For more information on property tax, contact the appropriate taxing authority in the jurisdiction where property is located. Now, what happens to us as realtors sometimes, especially when we have new home buyers who've never owned before and don't understand how taxes can fluctuate, or even insurance in the next paragraph. And all of a sudden they were told that they're paying $2,222 a month. And then all of a sudden they get a bill that's $2,314 and they're freaking out because it's not what they're expecting to pay and they don't understand. Now, mind you, they've been communicated with from their county that their taxes have gone up. Their mortgage companies probably sent them a letter stating that their taxes are increased, therefore their escrows are going to be increased, but most people don't read their stuff. And you were the agent who sold them their house or the lender who helped them. One, two, or both of you are going to get that phone call. It happens. It's happened. And you just need to say, please call your lender. They can explain those fees to you. You can say something like, it's possible that your property tax went up. If you remember in the contract, it said that could happen. But don't try to get into the weeds with them. Don't try to say, well, send me information, see what I can figure out. That's not your job. It's not your job. And I've had clients who have been friends say, well, just as a friend, can you help me? I'm like, I'm crossing the line as a realtor right now. I got to be careful with that. Because if I tell you something as a friend and you don't like it or something bad happens from it, you can come after me for my license. So that's why I can't cross that line, okay? Property insurance. Obtaining property insurance is typically a requirement of the lender in order to secure financing. Insurance rates and availability are determined in part by the number and nature of claims and inquiries made on a property's policy, as well as number and nature of claims made by a prospective buyer. Property insurance has become difficult to secure in some cases, sellers should consult an insurance professional regarding maintaining and or terminating insurance coverage. So when it comes to like condos and the like, when the ratios are off, lenders won't lend there, and then sometimes insurance companies won't lend there because their budget's out of balance. So even if you get a mortgage company who will lend there, an insurance company may not. And that's why in that first 7 days of securing your financing and everything, your insurance is part of that because it's part of your mortgage payment. You know, you should be talking, your buyer should be talking to insurance companies and finding out how much of the insurance is going to be on that property. When a lender's looking at those figures, they're using a broad scope for that neighborhood or whatever. But an insurance company is looking at that specific property. And if the previous people have had a flood there, the insurance company knows about it if a claim was made on their insurance. So it'll come up in the records. And they may say, well, there's a history of flooding. And you as a buyer may not know that. So that's something can come up. Title insurance. Buyer may, at buyer's expense, purchase owner's title insurance. Depending on the particular circumstances of the transaction, such insurance could include affirmative coverage against possible mechanics liens, which we spoke about, material man's liens, someone who's supplying material for labor and materials performed prior to settlement, and which, though not recorded at the time, a buyer's deeds could be subsequently recorded and could adversely affect buyer's title to property. And we went over that a little bit earlier with mechanics liens. The coverage afforded by such title insurance would be governed by the terms and conditions thereof, and the premium for obtaining such title insurance coverage will be determined by its coverage. So when you go to a title company, like I said, there's usually standard policy and premium policy. It's a one-time fee. It's not a yearly fee. A lot of buyers don't understand that. They think it's something they're going to pay yearly. It's a one-time insurance fee. Buyer may purchase title insurance at either standard or enhanced or premium coverage rates for purposes of owner's policy. Premium rate disclosure by buyer's lenders, if any. Buyer and seller require that the enhanced rates be quoted by buyer's lender. So when the lender is quoting the buyer's good faith estimate, they're quoting the highest amount. Okay, they're quoting the premium rates. So the buyer can't feel that they've been, tricked or whatever when it comes to what their estimated monthly fee would be. Buyer understands that nothing here within obligates buyer to obtain any owner's title policy coverage at any time, including at settlement, and that the availability of enhanced coverage is subject to the underwriting criteria of the title insurer. So a buyer never has to buy title insurance, okay? And they can choose to, but you as an agent do not give them advice on whether to do it or not. I always read the mechanics lien thing to them. Make sure they understand if something does come up like that, that it's on their deed as a debt owed. But again, I can't advise them to get it or not. Now, they always will be paying the lender's title policy. It's part of their payment is to pay for the lender's title policy. So if something does happen against the home, let's say a long lost heir shows back up and claims that property, the lender's covered, but the buyer's not if they don't have a title policy, okay? The lender will get their money back, but the owner would be out of a home. Assignment. This contract may not be assigned without written consent of buyer and seller. If buyer and seller agree in writing to an assignment of this contract, the original parties to this contract remain obligated hereunder until settlement. So it could be that, let's say my husband and I we're in the middle of putting a trust together, for example, and a property comes up that we really want to buy, and and we're going to settle on the property like August 15th, but our trust isn't going to be done till August 10th. So, you know, Mark and Deborah, not Debbie, Deborah A. Roof and Mark Debbie Roof are going to buy this property at 1234 Main Street. And we might say Deborah A. Roof, Mark W. Roof, or assigns, because really, once our trust is done, we really want it to go into the trust name at closing. We save money on the deed that way. We don't have to have the deed redone, okay? But the seller has to agree to it. So as the buyer's agent, I would say to the seller, my buyers are working on a trust. It's expected to be ready and done before closing, so they would like the deed, and their lender's on board with it, that the house is deeded into the trust, and the seller agrees. So it's Anna signs. We don't know what the name's going to be yet. That's why it's just Anna signs. We can assign it, and we may not assign it. It might get to be that the trust documents aren't ready until we close on the house, and therefore we buy it as ourselves, and then we have to have a deed redone to place it into the trust. Okay, so that's an example of an assignment. And another assignment could be, you might have an investor who's buying property to rent out, and they want to do an LLC. So they might say Deborah A. Roof, Deborah A. Roof or assigns, because I'm trying to get my LLC set up, and I'm hoping it'll be set up before I go to closing on the property, because I want everything to be in the LLC instead of my name personally. And so that might be where an assignment comes in. But again, if it's not done by the time you close, it goes in the original person's name, and the original person is obligated throughout. Another situation I've seen is a situation where a son is overseas, coming back, due to be back before closing on a property. But the father is purchasing the property in his name. The father's doing all the writing. Everything is in the father's name. The father and son are on the loan together, but eventually it's going to just be the son. And so the father or assigns, because the son does not have signing capabilities for whatever reason. In a situation, could be that they're secure somewhere in another country and just can't do paperwork right now. And so then it's assigned to the son. So then if the son gets back before closing, then it becomes the property of the sons. Okay, those are a couple examples that I know that we've had dealt with over the years where assignments come into play. The most common usually is the investor and the LLC and the trust.
Yeah,
Okay?
Deb, have
Yes.
you also seen investor George takes it, and because he's actually a wholesaler, and he doesn't want to put it in trust. He just wants to assign it to another agent, to another investor.
Yes, and that can happen. Yes.
And so, but this would just putting it up in the front on the buyer's say, you know, investor George investor, or assigns at the beginning that would cover it.
Yes, that covers it, or assigns, exactly. So it's the name of who's buying it or assigns. And then the seller has to agree to the assignment. Now, if you're on the listing side, I would always say, what's the assignment for? And find out a little bit of background. Because I want to know that it's going to close, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I want to know that who, you know, what's the reason for the assignment before I'm going to advise my sellers to go ahead and sign the offer. Okay.
But once
So-
they sign it, that you're assuming at that point that they.
Correct.
If
If
they
a
don't
seller
have.
crosses through the word or assigns, that means they're not accepting the assignment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, definitions. Listen up, people. They have this paragraph in here for a reason, and you make sure your clients understand it, especially if they've never bought a home, especially if they haven't bought or sold in years, and just because, okay? Because people view things differently, and from state to state, things are viewed differently. So date of ratification means the date of delivery of the final acceptance in writing by buyer and seller of all the terms of the contract to buyer and seller, not the date of expiration or removal of any contingencies. So what that means is This is the buyer and this is the seller. The buyer makes an offer to the seller. Okay. One case scenario, the seller agrees to everything, initials and signs everywhere. And then and this is the contract, and then they send it back to the buyer. So buyer and seller both have initialed everything. Then the buyer's agent then ratifies it because it's been delivered back fully signed. Okay. Another scenario would be the buyer makes an offer, sends it to the seller. They make a few changes. They initial their changes, cross through additions, subtractions, additions, whatever. They send it back to the buyer and the buyer agrees. They then initial it. So everything has all the same initials, all the same signatures. At that point, the buyer's agent delivers it to the listing agent as a fully executed document with everyone's signatures. At that point, the listing agent ratifies it and then disperses it back out to everybody. So what confuses people sometimes is they think it's one or the other. It can be either the buyer or the listing agent who does the ratification. It's the agent who receives the fully executed document of all pages pertaining to the document, not just this one, but all the addenda that are associated with it are all fully signed and executed. The agent who receives the fully executed copy is the one who puts a ratification date on that last page, page 58, page 12 of the contract. They're the ones who does that. Now, what can happen sometimes, and I talked to Shannon about this because it's come up with me transaction coordinating with over the years. And we're in a busy market and people are really busy. And let's say in the middle of the day, everyone's agreeing on the deal. So it's not like it's 9 p.m. at night. Let's say the seller has made all their counter offers and their changes and sent it back to the buyer, and the buyer signs and does everything, and they've got the fully executed copy. So it should go back to the listing agent to sign, but the listing agent has asked in writing, make sure it's in writing, that the buyer's agent, while having their clients initial and sign everything, go ahead and put the ratification date and send it back out, okay? Long as the listing agent and the seller or the other side understand that it's a request for ministerial act to be done in writing, it's okay to do that. But where it becomes an issue is when it's late in the evening. That ratification date affects the buyer's contingencies. So that's where you want to be careful. So when it's in the evening, I would not do it as a courtesy. I would send it back to the other side and have them initial it, because if they don't open it up, or, I'm sending it at midnight, I'm sending it at 11:50 and I'm trying to make today the ratification date, but it's really the next day, that affects the buyer's contingency times, okay? So just be careful about that when you're asked to ratify something. Just make sure if you do, and it seems reasonable to you, think through it and which side of the coin you're on too, buyer or seller, and make sure the other agent has requested in writing that they understand that you're going to, as a ministerial act, as a courtesy, add the ratification date that they're accepting delivery, okay? Appraisals mean written appraised valuation of the property. It's done by a professional. It's not a CMA, which is a cost market analysis. It's not a REO or broker's opinion, a BPO broker's opinion or anything like that. It's an appraisal. It's done by an appraiser, okay? The buyer generally pays for it. Days and days, capital or not, plural or not, means calendar days in Virginia unless otherwise specified in this contract. So that means that if we ratify today, so I'll put today's date, which is the 30th, on page 58 as the ratification date for this contract, and I have a 7-day contingency, then 31 is day one. It's the next day following the ratification date. 31, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in Virginia, August 6th at 9 p.m. means that whatever contingency I'm working with expires if nothing happens with it. Okay? So it's the day of ratification, and the counting starts the very next day, and it is straight calendar days unless otherwise specified. Now, some agents will put in the contract business days. If I'm a listing agent and I receive that, then I'm either going to say Monday through Friday. I'm going to make them declare Monday through Friday, because Saturday is a banking business day. So it's kind of ambiguous. I, as a listing agent, may consider a business day being Saturday, where the buyer's agent didn't intend it to be Saturday. So if anyone ever uses business days, you need to make sure you clarify it, because when it comes to contingencies, it becomes a mess on who thinks what ended what day, okay? So you just clarify that, like in section 41, there right above the ratification date. If you're using business days, then you need to say business days Monday through Friday, excluding holidays. Now, what I say to people, instead of saying 7 business days, why don't you say 10 days? It's simpler. It's so much simpler than using the business days. It can become very convoluted. I've seen too many arguments. I've seen too many fights. I've seen too many missed days on contingencies because the other side did not comprehend what was being said, and are trying to force avoidance of a contract. So just be very careful. It's sad that we have to have number D in here, letter D. All references to time of day shall refer to the time of day in the Eastern Time Zone of the United States. Because we're in the state of Virginia and we're in the Eastern Time Zone of the United States. Okay. Because we are dealing with contracts from people around the world sometimes, you as a listing agent, you as a buyer's agent need to make sure that if your client is outside of the East Coast United States, that if they're in Germany, you look up at the world clock and you say, okay, if it's this time here, what time is it in Germany? And you let them know that in such and such day by their time in Germany, these documents have to be, the contingency ends, okay? So, 9 p.m. here on, say, the August 6th is sometime in the early morning hours of August 7th in Germany, So there's a time difference. So it's all based on, now that can be negotiated too. If you say, I want everything done by 5 p.m., buyers and seller agree, you can certainly change it to 5 p.m. wherever 9 p.m. shows up, okay? 9 p.m. is an arbitrary time the state of Virginia uses. I know there's a movement to change that time, especially because agents want to say our hours end at 8. So when you're getting close to a contingency expiring and it's the day of the expiration, you have to be available. You have to be available for any type of negotiation to happen up until 9 p.m. And back in the fall, I was in one of those negotiations on a Sunday night. At 8:35, the home inspection contingency came in. It was expired at 9 p.m. Their list of demands. So, back and forth until 9 p.m. And at 9 p.m., had we not agreed, then they had the option to void or not, that type of thing. But you have to be available and awake, and you be aware of those. You just can't go to bed early that night or go to a movie. So yeah, you can't go to a movie. if your contingencies haven't expired and it's the day they're due to expire, you have to be available to receive and negotiate, okay? The masculine includes the feminine, singular includes plural. That's Old English. That's the way contracts are written. It doesn't mean anything. It's just an easy way without having to say all the days, like that. It's just means a thing. Legal expenses means attorney fees, court fees, litigation expenses, if any, including but not limited to expert witness fees and court reporter fees. Notices, notify. Means a unilateral communication, which means a one-way communication from me to you. Communication from one party to another. All notices required under this contract will be in writing and will be effective as of delivery. Written acknowledgement of receipt of a notice is a courtesy but not required. Now there's a document that says, acknowledgement of notice, but it clearly states right here that it's not required. It just requires notice. Now, as an agent, whenever you're sending any document to your clients or the other side, or to anyone, and just getting a practice for your own personal business too, always ask them to acknowledge it in an email that they received it, a simple received. I tell my clients, when I send you a document that you need to read and review, I'm not asking you to read and review and tell me you received it. I'm asking you right away that you just acknowledge it, receive the attachment. And then the answer, if I need an answer, I will specify what time I need the answer by, but I just want to know that you've received my communication, whether it has an attachment or not, Are you willing to accept $500 in lieu of the seller fixing the repairs? Please acknowledge receipt of the email. We'll call you later to discuss options type thing. And that way they're just letting me know they received it. They can think about it. I can check in with them and discuss the pros and cons. Check with their lender, whatever we need to do in those cases. But I always ask for someone to give me acknowledgement. Or let's say you're having an issue personally with, say, your insurance company, and something's wrong on your bill and you call the insurance company. It's always very prudent to write down who you spoke to, the date, the time, and ask them, do they have a number associated with them, like a customer number, that if you ever had to call back, you could refer to. That way you have a track record of who you spoke to, so it's more legitimate if you had to go before a judge. Hey, here's all my communication with Agent B over there. They said they received this, and they can't stand up in court and tell you they never received it, because right here I show that they received it. And yes, we've been in those situations, Steve and I, with agents having to prove that in fact the other side did get knowledge of whatever they say they never had knowledge of. Now with command, there's a way to capture text and stuff, but if you're getting text on your phone from the other agent, because it's easy that we all do that, then you need to save those texts into a document and memorialize them with your offer, in case, especially if it's anything that's pertinent or is a response to receiving something. Because I could have sent an email to an agent and said, please acknowledge you received this email, but instead of emailing me back, they text me, got your email. Well, that doesn't tell me what email they got, right? So I want to put them together and make sure I'm covering myself. This is the paralegal speaking here, the former paralegal, okay? All right, buyer and purchaser may be used interchangeably in this contract and in accompanying addenda or notices. So we mainly say the word buyer and seller, but purchaser sometimes will show up as like purchaser's agreement, stuff like that. It just means the buyer. Seller subsidy is a payment from the seller towards the buyer's charges, including but not limited to loan origination fees, discount points, buy down or subsidy fees, prepaids, or other charges as allowed by lenders, if any. A lender may not allow a subsidy. You always have to ask up front. It is buyer's responsibility to confirm with any lender that the entire credit provided herein may be utilized. If lender prohibits seller from the payment of any portion of this credit, then said credit shall be reduced to the amount allowed by lender. That's why you know, I, along with my client, when we're discussing subsidy right up front, the minute they meet with the lender and I know what their buying and purchasing power is, I right away in an email back to the lender, I said, as we're preparing to look at properties, please share with me what credit, if any, can my client accept from a seller? What subsidy, what credit? Same thing, subsidy, credit. And the lender might say something like a flat fee, or might say 3% of the sales price, or 13,000, or whatever it is. So that's the maximum amount that they can get, okay? So then if they've already gotten a subsidy from the seller at that maximum amount, and then the seller then wants to give them subsidy over and above that because they don't do repairs, so it really depends on how much earnest money they put down, whether that may or may not be allowed. But the lender has to say yay or nay. So some of the ways you can use up that extra money is that the lender might agree to, like, the seller prepaying condo or HOA fees for a year or two, or buying home warranties. But again, the buyer has to agree to that and the seller has to agree to it, okay? So be very careful with the seller subsidy. Just don't throw something out there and hope if you agree to it in writing and your client can't take it, then they've lost it, right? So miscellaneous, this contract may be signed in one or more counterparts, each of which is deemed to be an original, and all of which together constitute one and the same instrument. Documents obtained via facsimile machines will be considered as originals. Typewritten or handwritten provisions included in this contract will control all pre-printed provisions that are in conflict. Okay, so if anything is typewritten or handwritten over top of what's originally written there, okay, it will control, it becomes the priority. So the first part of this about counterparts, this happened to me 3 years ago with my client. I represented the buyer. The seller lived out of state. His property had been a rental for many years. He lived up in the hills, far out in the country of northern New York. And he did not have a facsimile machine. He did not have a cell phone. He did not have a computer. He did not have a printer. He had a landline. So the moment I talked to the listing agent to find out particulars, she told me the issue right up front. So we made our home inspection contingency period a little bit longer than normal, because what she told me she had to do was she has to FedEx everything to his home, which even overnight was a 2-day FedEx. So can you close that door for me? Thanks. Thank you. So what they had to do was, so she had to send the offer to her client and then walk him through and have him sign it. Then she had to call FedEx to come back to pick up the offer, because she would send an envelope along with it ready to come back to her. Okay, so that took several days even for us, the offer to get. So then after that, what we did was I presented her with our home inspection contingency removal, for example. She sent it to her client, and we verbally discussed back and forwards what we were going to do. He handmade his changes on his copy. I electronically made my changes on my client's copy. The words were identical. So everything was the exact same thing. He signed his copy in hand. My client signed their copy on DocuSign. So we had 2 copies of the home inspection contingency release form. The verbiage all matched, but we didn't have to wait for him to initial send it back to us and back and forth. We negotiated over the phone. So we had 2 identical pages, one that the seller signed and one that the buyer signed. So that's what it means by counterparts. The counterparts become together and become one. They're married up together, so 2 of the same page. So if someone was flipping through the file, they might right away say, oh, wait a minute, there's only one signature on here. They should realize that there's two, one has buyer, one has seller. And that was the way we were able to speed up the process between us. Now that agent didn't understand that, and I went over this paragraph with her and explained to her what it meant. And she checked it out with her broker, who said, yeah, she's right. You could do that. And that made our negotiation time period and getting the deal done considerably less because of the FedExing and the time frame up there. He wouldn't even go to the library and use the fax machine. We tried to set all that up too, but he wouldn't do it. Okay. So, and you will run into situations like that. You will run into people who want to hand sign. An agent here in the office just got a listing and the seller refuses to do anything electronically. Everything has to be in his hand signing. Now the other side, he agrees that the buyers and the broker can electronically sign, but he himself does not want to electronically sign anything. Void the contract. Void contract. If this contract becomes void and of no further force and effect without default by either party, both parties will execute the release, directing the deposit be refunded in full to the buyer according to the deposit paragraph, which we went over, that the seller cannot refuse. It's just voided based on home inspection or whatever. HOA, condo, whatever the buyer chooses to void on, they can choose within the time frame appropriate. Paragraph 34, home warranty. Okay, so in a seller's market, you probably not want to go in and put that the seller is going to pay for the home warranty. Okay, but let's read the paragraph. The home warranty, yes or no? Home warranty policy selected by the buyer or seller and to be paid for and provided at settlement by the buyer or the seller. So in an even market or a buyer's market, you might say, yes, I want a home warranty. The buyer's going to select it. The seller's going to pay for it. And it's not going to exceed $700. And it's going to be done by Choice, HMS, Cinch, 210, whatever the others are. Whatever the warranty company is, you're going to specify in there what it is. So when the buyer is asking the seller to pay for it, that becomes negotiable. The seller can say yes or no. Okay. If the buyer wants a home warranty, then the buyer is going to say yes, the buyer wants to select it, the buyer is going to pay for it, and here's the amount of money. The seller has no right to really cross through that. Okay, because the buyer is buying it for themselves. So what I've seen happen a couple times is a slap happy listing agent doesn't read the paragraph. So they cross through it and say no. And then you have to call them up as the buyer's agent and gently say to them, I'm sorry, perhaps you didn't see that on paragraph 34 that my buyer wants a home warranty. They're going to select it and they themselves are going to pay for it. Can we please put that back in the contract? But when it's the seller being selected, then again, if the seller's going to pay for it, the listing agent may say that they want the seller to use the company that they choose. So again, that part's negotiable. Okay, but please make sure you put the amount of money in there, especially if you're asking the seller to pay for it. And if you have an older home and that home warranty company has a premium policy plan where you can have an extra, it might be around $100 extra, but it will cover when, let's say, a hot water tank has to be replaced. The old ones were tall and skinny. The new ones are short and fat. They may not fit in the same footprint, and certainly the pipes aren't connected. So what that means is in the home warranty policy, and most of them, the home warranty will cover the replacement of the hot water heater, but it does not cover the replacement of the repiping and the refitting. Okay. My hot water heater went out and the guy looked at me and goes, well, we have to take 3 inches out of your daughter's room. I'm like, no. And I said, what about tankless? Can we go with tankless? And so it was a more expensive deal for me up front, but I didn't lose, we didn't have to shrink down a bedroom in order to accommodate the closet that the hot water heater was in because of the new EPA regulations and the size and the way it is. Okay. All right. Time is of the essence. Time is always of the essence in real estate, but that doesn't mean you can't take a moment to stop, reflect, and read. Okay. So when you get an email from somebody, read it carefully, read it twice, read it 3 times even before you respond. Make sure you're understanding what they're actually saying. And if you're not understanding what they're saying, ask them. I don't know, and some of you have probably got some of my talk texting messages and you wonder what I've said. Siri likes to change my words all the time. So, and especially when I'm driving, and I always try to say to you, I'm talk texting. If it doesn't make sense, call me. So time of the essence means that the dates and time frames agreed by the parties must be met. Failure to meet date, times, and time frames will result in a waiver of contractual rights or will be a default on the terms of the contract. Okay, so if you say my home inspection contingency is ending on Sunday at 9 p.m., okay, and I'm the seller and I'm the listing agent, and here it is Sunday at noon, and your home inspector hasn't even shown up to my house, okay, and your contingency ends at 9 p.m., your agent should not be calling me the next day crying because you couldn't get a home inspection scheduled. That agent should have called me days before and said, look, because of the market so crazy and busy, the home inspector, we can't get a home inspection until Monday. Can we all agree to extend our deadline till Tuesday at 9 p.m. or Tuesday at 5 p.m. even? And that can be agreed upon and discussed, but not at 9:01 p.m. No. Now, Steve would say that if everything is moving forward and you want to continue on and you have no other deals, no other offers in the wings, and you want to sell the property, by all means negotiate and agree upon and accept a delayed time frame, long as everyone agrees upon it and it's in writing. Okay. If this contract is contingent on financing and the contingency has not been removed or satisfied, any delay of the settlement date necessary to comply with buyer's lender's obligations pursuant to the Rusbotilla Act integrated disclosure rule is not a default by the buyer, but seller may declare the contract void in writing. Nothing herein shall prohibit the parties from mutually agreeing in writing to extend the settlement date under the terms acceptable by both parties. So with the financing contingency, you're going to see 2 options now. But again, if the seller doesn't want to wait till it gets figured out, the seller can void the contract after the contingency expires. Arbitration. Nothing in this contract shall preclude arbitration under the Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice of the National Association of Realtors. So if there is a conflict between parties, instead of going to the court system, you can go through arbitration. Okay. Real estate license parties. The only time this field is filled in is if one party or more than one party involved as buyer or seller, okay, is also an agent. So when I sold my house in 2017, I was an active agent in the state of Virginia and I was the seller, okay? So I had to check off as an active agent in Virginia, I'm a seller. So it acknowledges that Deborah A. Roof was an active agent in the state of Virginia and she was the seller. Now, in my sister's case, when I sold her property, then I said Deborah A. Roof is an active agent in the state of Virginia, but is related to one of the parties in the transaction, okay? And even when it was someone who was peripheral, not a biological nephew, but someone who called me Aunt Deb, I went ahead and put that I was related to the party. Because, you know, when you're walking around and you're at a settlement table and he says Aunt Deb, you don't want people to all of a sudden get suspicious that something's not right. It was just better to do that. I erred on the side of caution in that regard. Now, when I sold my house, I was the seller, I was an active agent, and an agent was the buyer who was an active agent who bought the place. So we both laughed because both of our title companies called us and said, who is what in this deal? Because we had to add it all in there. So we had buyer, both of us were agents and stuff. So we, it was a very messy paragraph, but we got the title companies straight and they were all good with that. All right, the entire agreement. This contract will be binding upon the parties and each of their respective heirs, executors, administrators, successors, and permitted assigns. Now see, the other words don't have the word permitted, remember. It falls to the heirs, okay? It's a binding contract that falls to the heirs, but when it comes to assigns, that means the seller has agreed. The provisions not satisfied at settlement will survive the delivery of the deed and will not be merged therein. This contract, unless amended in writing, contains the final and entire agreement of the parties, and the parties will not be bound by any terms, conditions, oral statements, warranties, or representations not herein contained. The interpretation of this contract will be governed by the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Okay, so this document, which is now 2 pages less than it used to be because they got rid of a lot of the HOA and condo stuff that's kind of repetitive and redundant. It's now 15 pages long. So the 15-page document is the contract between buyer and seller. Okay, now if you have a buyer who's paying cash, okay, and the house is part of an estate where the seller doesn't have to do a deport document, and it was built after 1978, so there's no lead-based paint, and the purchaser doesn't want a home inspection, then this 15-page document could constitute the entire document, okay? Could constitute the entire agreement, which is very rare, okay? But it could. So then paragraph 39 is where you start making your changes. Now, this is where I start. When I'm writing an offer for somebody, this is where I start, okay? So I bring up my document. I bring up the listing. If you can split your screen, it's great. Or tab between them. But I bring it up and I read what the listing online says. I look at the date of the home. I know that my clients want a home inspection. I know. So then as I'm building my folders and building my file, I've got this document up, and then I go and I check. Yes, I want a home inspection. The house was built after 1978, so no, I don't need a lead-based paint. No, I don't have any contingencies or extra clauses, or maybe I do. No to pre-settlement. And by the way, pre-settlement, be extremely careful about pre-settlement. And if you're a listing agent and the buyer's agent calls and says, hey, can my client move in stuff the day before closing? You want to talk to your broker about that, okay? Because they then can take possession. So you got to be very careful about that. Because what about if it doesn't close? Then you got to get their stuff out of the house. So be very, very careful about pre-settlement occupancy, okay? Residential property disclosure, remember that's provided by the seller. So as a buyer's agent, I'm not pulling that document in. I'm getting that from, hopefully it's on MLS. I'm downloading it. I'm adding it to my package. Then FHA home inspection notice, okay? If I'm doing an FHA, and we'll get to that notice probably on Tuesday, part of the miscellaneous stuff, but it's a notice that basically says, for your protection at home inspection, okay? It is required with an FHA home inspection. It is not required with any other financing. So if it's an FHA, then it's required, then you say yes. If it's a VA, conventional cash, USDA, it's not required. You can say no. unless you choose to give it to your client. It just adds more paper to the pile. Then you can choose, is conventional financing, yes or no? Now remember, you're marking yes or no. You're not leaving the other one blank. It's, you mark one or the other. Don't leave the other one blank. Don't leave anything blank. Okay. And then this is new, the extension of review period for condominium resale certificate, property owners association disclosure packages. So if someone's asking for an extension and there's a document pertaining to that, then you would say yes. Otherwise, it's no. You're looking at the listing. Is there a private well or septic? Then you need that document or you don't. Is there a post-settlement occupancy? Now, unless the listing mentions it, I would say no. And then if it becomes a negotiation piece later, that's up to the seller and the buyer. But you as a buyer's agent, if you haven't been told by the listing agent that they're not seeking a post-settlement occupancy agreement, which is a rent back, another term, the document's called post-settlement occupancy. We colloquially call it a rent back, where the seller is renting back from the buyer for a specific period of time, generally not to exceed more than 60 days. Most lenders really only like it up to 45. Some will stretch it out to 60, but no longer than that, because then it becomes an investment property and it can change the interest rate. Okay, lead-based paint disclosure. Again, as a buyer's agent, I'm not downloading that document from my forms portal. I'm getting it from MLS, hopefully, or from the listing agent if they don't provide it ahead of time. And then if it's not conventional financing, is it FHA, VA, or USDA? Yes or no? And then here for yes, it could be something here, could be a COVID addendum. It could be buying the house sight unseen. We'll talk about that on Tuesday as well. We might start some of that here in a little bit, but we'll see. It could also be that you're paying cash, but your client's paying cash, but they want an appraisal. So it would be yes, appraisal for non-financing, which is cash only. Okay, so that's kind of where I start building my file from, and then I go out and bring my stuff in accordingly. But I need to know what the listing says, what my client wants, what their loan package is, and then I know what documents I'm pulling in. Okay. Disclosure of sales price to appraiser. Listing broker and selling broker are hereby authorized to release the sales price listed and specified finance in paragraph 2 the appraiser who contacts them to obtain this information. So as a listing agent, so it's the buyer's lender who hires the appraiser, okay? But generally the appraiser is going to call you, the listing agent, to get access to the home. They're going to schedule time to come through the home and you're going to meet them there. Most of them are not on central access. So it's a good thing that you as the listing agent goes to meet them, because if you've done really great comps for your home and the appraiser is not aware of what your client may have done inside, and you can show them financials of things that were done in the home, it could affect that appraised price to be higher than it may otherwise be if they didn't know that, okay? And so I had a listing in Centerville, a young couple. I helped one of my students. It was his first buyer, bought a place, and a year and a half later got a transfer out of state. That was a great job opportunity. And in the meantime, he and his wife had renovated the kitchen had been renovated in the townhouse, but they went ahead and renovated the rest of the home during the 18 months that they had it. So they upgraded a lot. They actually had natural stone in the shower. It was gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. Overdone for the area, but the one feature that the appraiser really liked was their room was so much larger because they took out the traditional bathroom door opening it, which made the bathroom larger, and they put a barn door in that slid because they couldn't do a pocket door, so they did the barn door. But the client it was recent enough that they were able to give me the flooring, the money they spent on the flooring and the toilets and the sinks and the tubs. And so they gave me a list of everything they spent on, and I put it on a feature sheet that was online at MLS, part of the package. So when the appraiser came through, all the money was right there for her. She took a couple pictures and she says, yeah, I have no doubt. And it was the highest property that had sold in that neighborhood because everything was detailed out. She could see it. Now, had I not met her there, had I not, provided her with that, she may or may not have appraised it at the price we were asking for it. It's hard to know because it was quite a bit more than the other properties in the area. But we were rolling on the fact that they had put a lot of work into it and brought it up. So I've had appraisers meet me out there who said, look, you can tell me whatever you want, but I already tell you right off the bat what I've done. It's going to appraise, how much above, I don't know right now, but it's going to appraise. So, they're like, okay, thank you. When I sold my house in 2017, when the appraiser called, his phone number was out of state. And I said, where are you from? And he said, Pennsylvania. And I said, well, are you familiar with Falls Church, Pemmon Hills area? He goes, I think I've been there, but if you want to meet me with anything you have, I'm willing to look at it, okay? Because sometimes, neighborhoods are very specific. Certain times, one side of the street has more value than the other side of the street. So knowing that as a listing agent, sometimes you may have to help educate the appraiser, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. There's been appraisers who've done horrible jobs. A lot are using COVID as an excuse not to go on properties right now. And some appraisers are appraising low, and it can create a mess for the deals all around. So there's recourses you can take to challenge them on that. Another appraiser can be done. You can hire another, like the seller can hire an appraiser to come and appraise their property if they don't agree with what the buyer's appraiser is saying. But they're paying for it. In the seller's market, they're probably just going to say, let the deal go, and I'm going to move on to the next deal, right? So, so then here, buyers and sellers sign here. And throughout the document, as you see here, buyers and sellers have initialed all the pages. So you as a buyer's agent, you as a listing agent need to make sure before you send your documents back and forth that you've checked that your clients have initialed all their places, okay? Then down below, seller and buyer, okay? Now this dotted line here, that's where the contract ends. So this information is below the line. It's not required to fill out, but please do. And if you represent the buyer, because you're the one online, has the easy facility with the filling out this offer, fill in the listing agent's information. If you're the listing agent, provide the buyer agent with that information. That information sheet we talked about the other day, simply by updating your portal and MLS can help. But it makes for a clean transaction when the contracts are being sent to the title companies. This helps the title company know who the parties are. You as a buyer's agent, you as a listing agent, when you're working with somebody else, I look up every single agent on no matter what side of the aisle. Even as a transaction coordinator for years, I always looked them up. I always made sure they were still licensed. So what about if you get an offer tomorrow, the 31st of July, and that agent's license is expired, and you click on their name and it says they haven't done any of their continuing education. So by August 1st, they're no longer an agent. So they can't be working. Their broker needs to take over. So it doesn't hurt to double check that. I'm just super cautious. I've found over the years, not only people's licenses expiring, but I've also found people writing contracts who were not even agents. So, so just be very careful about that. Brokerages that are going, under, who had not renewed their license, that type of thing. So you got to be careful because we're paying commission out on that. Okay. All right. So rentals, we went over the agreement, right, the other day, because it's like the buyer's agreement, the listing agreement. We did that already. Kind of the same type of information. This is something new for those that have been around a while in Virginia. This is something you have to give to the buyer now, the tenant. So in command, I think I don't know if Shannon's made it a one document, which is 4 pages, or it's a document that's, but there's this, and then there is the acknowledgement of receiving this. So your tenant has to be given this document of all the tenant's rights, and then they have this acknowledgement that they've received it. And this is where they sign it, okay? And then you will have the landlord sign it as well, that the tenant has received this document. Again, the tenant can't say that they didn't know about all the stuff above. So as we look down through here quickly, it tells them right up front that the application is non-refundable. It talks about the written release, the disclosure, security deposit. So it's just a little glossary, okay? And you as new agents, I'm gonna charge you to read this, okay? I would like you guys to read this for yourselves so you understand it, okay? So a tenant, for example, fit and habitable premises. A tenant has the right to a fit and habitable rental unit in accordance with uniform statewide building code. The landlord must make all repairs needed to keep the premise fit and habitable. That includes heating and air, water. To enforce the right to get repairs, a tenant must be current in rent, give the landlord written notice, and wait a reasonable period. So it doesn't say how many days. If repairs are not made, a tenant can file a tenant assertion to the General District Court. This must be filed no later than 5 days after the rent is due. There is no rent withholding in Virginia except under repair and deduct. Okay, so here repair and deduct, so what does that say? So this is a glossary that your clients need to understand. So you guys read this, so when you're working with buyers and sellers, you can explain this to them in bullet points, okay? A tenant just can't cross their arms and say, I'm not gonna pay anything if they don't fix this. They have to follow the law and follow the rules, okay? Same here, lead-based paint. There's one for rental. So the language is a little bit different, but pretty much it parallels what we have for buyers. So if the house was built before 1978 and it's a rental, you have to provide the tenant with the disclosure and you have to give them the EPA book, okay? If you represent the landlord and the tenant comes in from Craigslist or Zillow or something, and they do not have an agent and you're representing the landlord and you're doing ministerial acts to complete and get them the lease, then you have to make sure you provide them as the listing agent the EPA book, okay? And normally as the tenant's agent or the buyer's agent, I would provide that to my client. When I know we're looking at property that's younger than 70, built before 78. Just like with sales, there's a lease addendum. So so the language is tenant and landlord as opposed to buyer and seller. So yay, we no longer have to cross through buyer, put tenant, cross through seller, put landlord, or make up our own form. They finally, a couple years ago, put up a lease addendum, okay? See, 2013. Rental application, I went through this with you guys the other day, correct? I have a memory of doing that, but it could have been someone else in person. Can someone tell me if we went through this?
We did.
Thank you. Sometimes I repeat myself with other
I
people.
have notes on it, so we must have.
Yeah, I thought so, but then I've had some one-on-one sessions lately, so I couldn't quite remember. Okay, so same with the listed agreement. This parallels the same type of language, except it's got lease terms. I can't remember if we went through this, but when you're meeting with your landlord in a sale, when you're a listing agent, it's just sell, you're selling the property and people are moving out. Here under lease terms, you have to ask your landlord, how many months are you willing, what's the minimum amount of months or years, and what's the maximum amount. So if it's 12 months minimum, which is 1 year, and it may not exceed 36 months, someone may say 12 months, and then they'll go from there. They want to do 12 months and then they'll redo a lease because they want to make sure they like the tenant, for example. And some people want a 36-month lease. So then for the monthly rental price, it's generally, what the market says it'll bear in that area. And if that home has newer appliances or whatever, you might get a $50, $100 more a month, but probably not much more than that. Okay, so it's kind of what's happening in the neighborhood is going to kind of dictate that price for you. But again, you can always try. On the tenant side, let's say you go into a neighborhood and they've got a place listed for $2,600 and everything else in there in the last few months is rented for $2,400, and you really can't see the significance of why they're doing 26. When you do the application, when your clients fill out the application, instead of putting in $2,600 a month, you would put in $2,400 a month because that's what your client's offering to pay for the rental property, okay? And then the landlord can negotiate back, okay? So as of the date, landlord owns more than 4 rental dwellings units in the Commonwealth or owns individually or through a business entity more than 10% interest in one or more than 4 rental dwelling units in the Commonwealth. Yes or no? And if they do, then the landlord, if they own more than 4, then the landlord needs to do the housing choice voucher, which is also known as Section 8. So they own less than 4, they're not required to look at Section 8 applications, but if they own more than 4, they are required to now. That's a new law come July, okay? And so people thought they were going to get away with it by putting everything in LLCs. Well, right here it says individually or through a business entity and more than 10%. So that they can't be covered from their LLCs to avoid doing Section 8 housing, okay? And for those who may not know what that is, that means that someone is on a government program through their county, and the county might say that it really depends on how many adults and kids are in the group and what the division of the sexes are, especially amongst the children, as to what size home they can rent. And of course, that's going to dictate a price point for the home. So I've seen Section 8 housing in the $4,000 before. So up in Northern Virginia. So it's not rundown neighborhoods or anything. So don't ever mistake that at all. Okay. Landlord will allow smoking or not allow smoking. And the landlord does not want smoking on their premises at all. I mean, the footprint of the property, not just inside the home. Please make sure they say that in the bottom of the section, okay?
Hey, Deborah. Sorry, Rob Gunderson. Hey,
I'm
so
sorry?
it says they have to consider it. Can they still legally discriminate it, or is it all things being considered equal?
All things being considered equal, yes.
Okay.
Now, honestly, in these days of COVID, those who had Section 8 rentals, most of them are probably getting some money, if not all, from the county, right? Where they may not be getting it from the tenant, but they should have
Well,
still
yeah,
been
government
getting it.
money's guaranteed every month.
Right.
Yeah,
And I know some people whose Section 8 could be like 70, 80% of the rental. So
yeah, I'm having a brain cramp on the name of the community, but it's one of the richest, biggest home gated communities in Spotsylvania County, has Section 8 housing in it.
Yeah.
There, you'd be amazed which ones are. There is a rumor, and in our investor group that we've been trying to dispel it by bringing in people that Section 8 are bad renters. They usually are just uneducated renters. They don't understand how to take care of a property because they've never had one before. their family not have really had one before either, that they ever had to take care of. So there's a lack of information, and we're finding that if our investors are educating their tenants, and it doesn't matter whether they're Section 8 or they're not, if they're educating their tenants, then they're ending up with good renters and they're keeping them.
So
Well,
the
that's
story-
just
Go
to
ahead.
piggyback on what Barbara said. It's on both parties, and it's not Section 8 people have to go through the same criteria, like a regular tenant. I'm working with like 5. I've been getting a lot of referrals for Section 8. They get vouchers based on the county they live in, like at $2,900. And the consumer, they're the ones that aren't educated. They basically get stereotyped because they're
Right.
Section 8. They have had homes, they've lived in homes, they've had hard times, and they've been on waiting lists, and I'm dealing with a lady now, she has 4 daughters, and they all work for the school board. So I think that it's the perception of,
Yeah.
I don't know, of the
Right.
investor groups or whatever, that they stereotype, and they need to be educated as well.
I
They do.
agree.
They do.
The
And
people I was telling you
they're
about
working things.
in Northern Virginia, the situation was that the mom with 5 children never worked. The father died unexpectedly in an accident. No life insurance. So overnight, she went from never having worked, having 5 children, husband passed away, and no other family members here. No other family members, period. They were totally on her own.
Another
So-
thing that makes them really good tenants is if they lose that voucher, they lose it forever.
Yeah, so-
it's hard to get
right.
them.
So it's
They're
educating them.
amazing.
Yeah, so education all around. So yeah, pets again. So again, with pets, be very careful about the pets, what size, what restriction. And then you have to think about the neighborhood if it's an HOA. Some places forbid anyone to have, what is it? Bulldogs and Rottweilers and pit bulls or whatever, pit bulls. And so it's not that the landlord's restricting it necessarily, but they could. And some landlords don't want cats, for example, or if you have a cat, it has to be declawed. It's in the application. And a landlord can, they have to give notice, 24-hour notice to come by and check their property. And, they want to make sure that their home is being maintained and the pets aren't affecting their homes. Okay. And then they can ask for specific deposits. And with pets, there's a pet addendum that goes along with it. Okay, and let's see. Did I go through this section? I did this with someone the other day, but it could have been a one-on-one. But same with, this part's the same. Utilities is pretty much the same. And then the only thing different here with utilities is who's paying for them, okay? In most cases, the tenant's paying all the utilities because it depends on how much they use or whatever. But if it's in a condo where the water's being paid through the condo, the sewage is being paid through the condo, and the trash is being picked up based on the condo fees, then the landlord pays for that. The tenant does not. It's part of the condo fees. Most cases, almost all cases I've ever known of, the condo fee is rolled into the rental price, just like like the mortgage plus the condo fee becomes the rental price, if you will. Because this landlord's going to maintain and make sure those condo fees are paid so that they're not, getting liens on their property because someone's not paying condo fees. So, and then the tenant's responsible for the utilities. Now, I've known situations where homes have had tenants who don't pay, and Washington Gas is very much like that. There's been properties where Washington Gas will not allow a tenant to pay. They make the landlord pay and collect the money from the tenant, okay? Because they just don't want to deal with cutting off the gas. And especially in the wintertime when they can't, and then they get in this, whole mess. So just like with the buyers and sellers, you have duties to perform as an agent. The internet marketing is the same, same with the coming soon. All that when it comes to a rental, okay. That's the application. I don't know why my mouse would not move forward. Okay, drives me crazy. Um, hmm. So there's like this, I don't know if anybody knows anything about MacBook Pros, but I've got this huge, large blinking light over there that makes me want to skip that many pages. And I don't know how, and I don't know how to get rid of it. I don't know why it's there. So the landlord dual representation, same thing. Okay, now we're starting to scroll. I've had this thing for 3 years. I haven't got used to it yet. I still work on the PC a lot. Okay, agent compensation here generally is 1 month's rent. So page 83, paragraph 12, broker compensation. So the landlord shall pay broker in cash a compensation of. So if you know the month is going to be $2,400, then it's $2,400. And then you can say, or 1 month's rent, because if you get $2,500, you want to get that 1 month's rent, right? Or you can simply say 1 month's rent, okay? And then also what can be done if there's seller, so if you've got a landlord rather, if you have a landlord who's willing to rent for 36 months, okay, then your compensation could be 1.5 months or 2 months, because they're going to save by not renting that out every year, okay? When they rent it out every year, they're going to pay an agent 1 month's rent, so 1/12 of their annual income. So you might get a landlord who's willing to rent up to 36 months. So you could say for 1 to 2 years, it's 1 month, but if it's a 3-year lease, it could be 1.5 months rent, or 2 months even. It's all negotiable between the agent and the landlord, broker and the landlord. Then tenant agency compensation is 25% of 1 month's rent, okay? And then no to other compensation. Again, as we spoke about the retainer fees before, if you're going to do retainer fees in anything, this might be where you would do it. You would be very specific with your client. You would add it down in the, add to the document that you'll show 3 properties, and after that, there's a $100 retainer for the next 3 to 5 properties, or whatever it is. And just be very kind, but direct, authoritative, if you will, about how we're going to scrub properties online as best we can before we go see. You're going to make sure that a condo, accepts it, whatever you need to do, that they're going to accept that condo allows a pet if the tenant has a pet. You're not going to go see no pet allowed condos just because they want to see inside. When they have a pet, they don't want to get rid of the pet. Okay, so things like that. You're not just going to open the door so they can see what that condo looks like. And if they say, well, and then you say, well, that means you're going to get rid of your pet because your pet cannot go there. So you got to focus that way. It's your time, okay? Then early termination, if you're going to charge a fee, just make sure you're the same across the board in your business practice. Then if a tenant purchases premises during the occupancy of the premise, then now this retainer fee here, I'm sorry, this is the landlord side, but on the rental side, you see what I'm saying? Here, rental here, a retainer fee here for the landlord. I don't know why you would do it unless you were going to fix something up for them, or, if it comes up, talk to your broker about it. But I'm thinking about this when it comes to representing the tenant. Here under E, you can say if the tenant decides to purchase the home within, and I always put 60 days here or 90, minimum of 60, usually I put 90, because if a tenant's going to want to purchase the property, I want them to have to move out before the opportunity to purchase with that, so they can't cut me out of the deal. And then I put 3% of the sales price. So if the landlord decides to sell to the tenant, then I want to be part of that transaction. And if I have a good relationship with that landlord, he should let me do that. but he's not going to pay 6% commission. But he might give me 3% to do the ministerial act of putting the deal together for the tenant to purchase the property. Okay. Confidential information, you keep that. Authorization to disclose other applications in response to inquiries from tenants or cooperating brokers. Broker may not disclose without landlord's authorization the existence of other written offers on the premises. If landlord does give such authorization, landlord acknowledges that the broker and leasing associates must disclose whether the offers were obtained by the listing agent or other members of the listing broker's firm or by cooperating brokers. So if an agent calls you and says, do you have any applications in hand? And you've got 3 from Fredericksburg office and 2 from EXP, then you say, yes, I've got 3 from the Fredericksburg agents and 2 from EXP. Like that. Because of course, any brokerage that can keep their money between the 2 parties in the brokerage helps the brokerage, and that's why you have to disclose that. Okay. Compliance with fair housing, enough said. Relocation, we've talked about it. Condo and property association together. If it's in a condo or an HOA, then the broker and the landlord must provide to, I say to the tenant, not to the broker. There's no need that me as the listing agent need to hang on to that document. I want them to give them to the tenant, a copy of the rules and regulations, and it's at the landlord's expense. And if there's any extra fees when they need to move in, we need to notify them of those fees. It needs to go into MLS. And then landlord is responsible for all association dues and fees. Landlord represents that the landlord is or is not current. Okay. This is why the landlord does not pass it on to the tenant and should not. Now the tenant could be responsible for paying for pool passes or parking passes. That's different than the actual association fees. They're dues. Lead-based paint, again, liens. What kind of liens does a landlord have on the property? If something were to go wrong, are they going to be upside down? You know, what about, you know, they're in bankruptcy? Would the house be sold in foreclosure? What happens to that tenant? So you got to be careful with stuff like that. Okay. You have to make sure the landlord has no agreement with anybody else. There's not 3 or 4 agents out there trying to rent their property, or that they themselves have it listed online somewhere, you know, and trying to take applications themselves. You have to make sure that no other person has the right to lease or purchase the property. And we mentioned that before. But if there's a will or some document that says someone has the first right of refusal to purchase or rent, that person has to be given the chance to turn it down before you can go forward. And then again, is a landlord an agent or not? A lot of agents will purchase investment property and you rent it out. So make sure you know that your client knows. The tenant knows that you're an agent and you're also the landlord. Again, like storage tanks and all that. And then as you're listing the property, is it currently listed? Is it tenant occupied? You need to know that. The landlord and tenant and the agent need to work together as the property goes on the market. So the landlord retains all the responsibility for the premises, including utilities. This is what the opinion of Washington Gas is. Maintains physical security and liability during the term of this agreement. Landlord is advised to take all precautions for safekeeping of valuables and maintain the property, just like with a normal listing, okay? Now, if a tenant's in the property, the tenant needs to take care of their valuables, and the agent needs to communicate with that tenant that people are going to be coming through the home. You need to make sure, you know, your jewelry's put up, you don't have cash laying out on the table, no firearms laying around and the like, okay? So again, you as the agent is not responsible for anything on the premises as far as security goes, and especially when it's vacant. If you do go to the home or an agent calls you and says, hey, I thought you said this property's vacant and there's a bedroll in the closet, or there's a pillow in a sleeping bag in the closet, it's very possible someone is breaking in and squatting on that property. You need to let the landlord know you as an agent are not responsible to figure that out if someone is in fact doing that, okay? And now sometimes landlords, depending on their insurance policy when it's vacant, they may hire someone to come and sleep at the property to keep their insurance going, but they need to let you know that that's what's going on, okay? And you need to be working with that person that's house sitting, if you will. In consideration of the use of the broker's services and facilities and facilities of the listing services, landlord and landlord's heirs and assigns hereby releases the broker and the broker designated agents and sub-agents, sales associates, employees of any multiple services and directors, officers, employees thereof, including officials of any parent association of realtors, except for malfeasance on any part of such parties, from any liability to the landlord of the vandalism, theft, etc. Okay, so pretty much the same language we've had before. Again, same with service providers and giving advice, same laws. This is a binding agreement. It's the same laws, the attorney fee clause, it's the same. So that's all very similar, okay? It is 2:47. We're going to stop there and we will pick up on the lease on Tuesday. So your homework, yay, you just love homework. And so many of you are so involved in doing the homework. Fill out the lease. Send me a copy by 5 p.m. on Friday. See if you can effectively put the lease together, okay? By reading it. So here's the parameters. The lease is for $2,500 a month. The lease starts on September 1st. But the tenant wants to move in on the 25th of August. So $2,500 a month, lease starts September 1st for 1 year, and the tenant wants to move in on August 25th. Okay, so see if you guys, see what you can come up with in filling out the lease, okay? Any questions?
I do have a question, real
Sure.
quick. It was about the warranty, and I know I have to stop doing this because of the Texas contract, but I just want to clarify, if I'm representing the buyer, I want to do everything I can to do what's in the best interest of my buyer. So when it comes to the home warranty, just because, I mean, put the buyer and I can put the seller to pay, but you don't advise to do it, or it's okay and then they could just counter?
If you're in a multiple offer area where you know there's gonna be multiple offers, I wouldn't do it.
Okay.
Because that could be something that could lose the deal.
Okay. Might as well do it just up front and just say, right, especially if it's a seller's market, just say buyer will pay for it. It's
Yeah.
$600. You don't want to lose a
Right.
deal for that.
Right.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, I mean, you could always say it. They can say no. They might you never know what the other side's going to say. But if they're looking at things to, like I was talking about the place I had 10 contracts on, and 5 were loans and 5 were cash, and then 3 had appraisals, and 2 had appraisals and 3 didn't. So right away we got rid of 7 offers right away. So it left 3 to really look at and negotiate. But we have to present everything to the other side. But as a listing agent, you're looking through for differences and stuff that could strike the deal, and that would be one of them. It's only $600, $700, but it could, strike the deal, so to speak.
Okay,
Any other
thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions, anyone? Okay.
Thank
Guys,
you.
took it all in today. You're just so filled with all the knowledge.